about spooky parts of the government, they often don't think about what I often thought was the spookiest part of the government, or at least I had no idea what they were really doing, was the Department of Energy. Are you willing to tackle that question?
Yeah, I'll talk. So I'll just say up front, I'll state my bias up front. I am a big proponent of the department and the work the department does across all facets of its activities. But I had the same experience in some ways. So I grew up in Western Washington State, Southwest Washington, Vancouver, Washington,
Oh,
just
where
outside.
uh, no, not Southwest. Southeast would be where the big lab is.
Yes, so I grew up in Southwest Washington and Vancouver, Washington, just outside of Portland, Oregon. And when I was growing up, was really when there was a lot of attention paid to the Hanford site in Eastern Washington, where the most of the plutonium work was done during the Manhattan Project, and we're still, cleaning it up and they're still dealing with that. And I had this similar experience when I was growing up the way it was treated, and I was obviously a kid, so I was just hearing things, I was reading what I could, but it was always like we don't know, nobody really knows what's going on out there, but we just know it's bad, right? It's dirty and
Yes.
it's nasty and it's related to nuclear weapons, so it can't be good. So it was a really interesting experience when I joined the department and went to
Yeah,
the
and
Pacific
that's the
Northwest
Department of
National Lab.
Energy.
And that was a Department of Energy project and a remarkable story of accomplishment during World War II. I used to take, so I worked in the Department of Energy's intelligence office, Office of Intelligence Counterintelligence for many years. I was the chief of staff. My last job was the chief of staff, and I was handling all of our congressional engagements. I used to take staffers and members down quite frequently to Oak Ridge. And
Mm.
part of that is because it's an easy trip, just a couple hours. There's like 6:49 flight, something like that. You can do it in a day. It's a long day, but you can do it in a day. But one of the things they have down there is the graphite reactor, which was the place where they were actually producing plutonium for the first time during the Manhattan Project. The reason I mention it is because they were building something at a much, much larger scale, just a few months behind in timing out in Washington State. And the to produce the plutonium for the Nagasaki weapon, what became the Nagasaki weapon. And it's a remarkable accomplishment, but it was done very quickly. I used to joke that in a way the department had if you could understand the department by breaking the budget into three pieces. One was the nuclear weapons program, one was the basic science research projects budget, and then the third is the recovery and cleanup on all the crazy stuff that we tried in the 40s and
Yeah,
50s,
right.
and actually even into the 60s. But there was a reason why they tried to do those things, and there's a through line through the history of the department. Some of it's, admittedly complicated, especially the testing history. But it is true the department is not well known. Like, Reagan advocated to dissolve the Department of Energy. People don't understand necessarily what the work is. And there's a belief that there's more of a regulatory function than there actually is. There's almost no regulatory function to the
Aren't
Department of
they
Energy.
responsible for gas prices?
Yeah. No, I mean, I remember once when Stephen Chu was Secretary of Energy, he was asked in a hearing about gas prices. I think he made the mistake of saying, so, well, they probably should be higher if you actually looked at the market.
Oh,
But also is really not in his purview to have any sort of real influence on oil, directly, at least on oil prices. But it's the department has its legacy in the Manhattan Project, right? The laboratories that were involved in creating the Manhattan Project, or the nuclear weapons and atomic weapons, as they said then, became the legacy sites. There's still so much of that that's focused. So much of the enterprise is still operating on Manhattan Project era facilities, which is pretty remarkable. I was just at a nuclear deterrence summit a couple weeks ago, and it was pretty remarkable how much of the conference was focused on finding, discussions of things like finding welders and electricians not how do we bring artificial intelligence to the fore. There was a discussion of the latter, but a lot of it was focused on, how do you make up for the deferred maintenance bill that is literally decades and decades in the process. But, it was
I don't think I
intentionally,
want to hear this.
Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
mean, it
Shh,
was
shh, shh.
all open. So I'm not giving anything away, but
I
it
know,
was,
no, it's like a little bit frightening that we have all
Yes.
this dangerous material
Where's
like
a welder?
in the
yeah, no, I
equivalent
mean,
of
at one
my
point,
20-year-old refrigerator. Mm.
especially at one point, it was a little bit tongue in cheek, but only a little bit. There's a remarkable DOE facility in Kansas City. It used to be called the Kansas City plant. Now it's called the National Security Campus, Kansas City. Um, and there's some work that they have anticipated in the future. They do the non-nuclear components of the nuclear weapons, manufacturing production of them. There's some work they have on the horizon, and they're literally now competing with the Kansas City Chiefs building a new stadium for craft workers. Anyways, it's just as the department shifts from stewardship of the stockpile to moving into production. But there was a time where you say shrouded in mystery. Absolutely, there was a time where you had to have a security clearance to know where some of these places that even some of these places even existed,
Right,
right?
right.
Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Richland, Washington, these places where the work was being done. That's why I really appreciated when Oppenheimer came out. Unfortunately, I think there were maybe some gratuitous scenes in there. I understand why they're there, but made it less easy to use it as a teaching tool. But it just is a good reminder of just how high the stakes were at that time
Hmm.
and the complications of the secrecy and just the urgency and the speed and just the existential threat that we faced as a nation, but also the scientists who were involved, many of them Jewish immigrants from Europe whose families perished in the Holocaust. It was an existential threat at an individual level and at a national level.
Right.
And we're still, in some ways dealing with some of the choices and decisions they made then. But no, you're right. It's a fascinating place. I used to love taking staff and members, or staffers and members, and other IC officials to the labs just to see the really remarkable work that is done. And it was always, I'm a big proponent of the department. I'm a big proponent of the embedded agencies broadly, and happy to chat about that. But DOE, it's a very interesting history that
Time out
coincides.
for a second.
Sorry,
For
I know
those who
I'm a
don't know,
bit of a monologue.
no, no. I just want to make sure I'm tracking because I'm sort of the outsider here, and if I'm not tracking, then I think other people might not be tracking. Embedded agencies, can you just define what that is?
Oh, so the agencies that are not the independent agencies, that so like CIA or ODNI, they're not the DoD agencies like NSA, NGA, NRO, DIA. They're the elements that are part of cabinet level agencies,
That are
and
intelligence
that are
elements.
intelligence elements that are identified in Title 50 as intelligence elements.
Got it. And so, like, DOE has embedded agencies within it.
Has an
Has one,
embedded intelligence capability.
yes.
Ah, okay,
State
that's what
So
it is.
Department has an embedded intelligence
So
capability.
it's not an agency, it's a capability that's embedded within.
well, it's considered an agency in the uh, 18, when you talk
Yeah,
about the
when the
intelligence
DNI
community
does the
being of
count.
18
Ah,
agencies, they
Uh-huh.
got
are,
it.
But
they,
one of the
they,
things they're talking about is like, I think the Treasury small intelligence function.
Or like commerce, I think
no,
has one.
commerce is not one.
I don't
Does
think
not?
commerce is one of them.
There
Okay.
are there are effectively four embedded elements the way I do the calculation. There's
Yeah.
Department of Energy's Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, Treasury's Office of Intelligence and Analysis. Interesting. DHS is INA, Treasury is OIA, even though they both have stand for the same thing. And then the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. You could also put the DEA's Office of Intelligence in there, but I would not include the FBI's intelligence component
Yeah.
as part of it. It's sort of a thing unto itself. There's actually a
What
lecture
about that defense counterintelligence agency that screens all the people?
so
Is that
DCSA's count. So there are these, if you look at the
He's the
law,
guy who can answer all these
Yeah, I know, I'm
questions. He
fascinated.
knows
yeah.
what all the acronyms stand for.
So if you look at the law, like if the cascading of the law, right, there's the Constitution as the basis of or any of this stuff happening. Um, there is the law, title most of it in Title 50. That most of the intelligence work is in Title 50. From there, you get Executive Order 12333 that lays out what the agencies can do. And then each agency has what are referred to as approved Attorney General procedures for activities, like what they can actually do. And a lot of those are unclassified and available through the President's Civil Liberties Oversight Board's website. I think they're still there. Post Snowden, everybody went through a rewrite. And a lot of it has to do with handling U.S. persons in counterintelligence investigations and in collections, but not exclusively. It has other stuff, and some of them are classified, so I don't think you can get to all of them. And then below that is the agency procedures, like CIA has AR, blah 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 blah, that dictates how you do your timesheet to like some tradecraft stuff. I mean, all sorts of things are there, and every agency has some sort of policy system. So, when I think about, there's actually a lecture I do in a couple of my classes about thinking about how you group agencies. There's the DoD elements, there's the independent agencies, the DoD elements, the combat support agencies, and then you can go through the embedded elements, the sort of inside the beltway, the defense intelligence enterprise. There's overlapping, and there's the DOJ elements. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to the big five, but the big five is situational. It doesn't always mean the same thing. We used to joke about the Agile 12, which I guess now would be the Agile 13. You have the service components. But when you say someplace like commerce, these are they call them now, it used to be referred to as non-Title 50 elements. So they were intelligence liaison elements that are not in Title 50, right? They're
Got it.
not formally part of the intelligence community. So
Right.
that means they can't do certain things. They can't like technically task collections directly. They're not supposed to be doing things that look like intelligence, like analysis collections. That said, there's some intelligence adjacent things that they're able to do. And this is getting super bureaucratic, an intelligence analyst across the agency, by and large, not universally true, but by and large, are referred to as O132s, right? They're intelligence research specialists under the OPM, Office of Personnel Management Job Classification System. If you read the job classification of O132s, it effectively says they're generalists, right? They're supposed to be able to operate across.
Right. It seems like you would have that in every agency.
And you do have them in lots of agencies, even those that are not intelligence
Right.
elements.
Well, right. I mean, because what are they doing? Analyzing data and trying to help inform decisions. I think every company and every agency and every organization needs those people, right?
But then there are also people who are like international affairs specialists and foreign
Mm,
affairs specialists. There's other categories of people who do things. But like if you want to hire an economist, in theory, you should go hire an economist. There's a job classification for economists. But if you
right.
hire an economist into agency X, then the expectation is they'll spend their careers being an economist and doing economist type of things
Right.
and not like, doing a detail into another part of an IC agency to improve their skills as an analyst. Anyways,
So do you think,
Or become like Michael Morrell, who's a famous, fairly well-known ex of CIA. I think he was deputy director. I'm trying to remember his
oh,
actual
he was acting director twice.
acting director. But
He was deputy director. Yeah.
Michael started off as an economist, and that was his degree. But he went off to do and work on gazillions of other types of
Yeah.
issues, and not well understood by the general public, or even the knowing,
Yeah.
the more specialist public, that agility is like a huge part of being mental agility of being an intelligence officer. And really, when we hire well, what we're hiring are really good thinkers,
And I'm
whatever
guessing,
that means.
and I'm guessing that he was never, I don't know specifically, but I'm guessing that he was never an economist under an OPM classification. He was probably an
You probably
0132
hired in as
as
an
an
international affairs specialist or as whatever that other
intelligence
one
research
was.
specialist. Yeah.
Well, Manoli, I think we've gotten to the point in our conversation where you can introduce yourself
Sure.
and tell us all how to correctly pronounce your last name.
So my correct pronunciation is well, it's technically it's Manolis Priniotakis, but I go by Manoli Priniotakis. There's kind of a complicated backstory as to why like people of Greek heritage, oftentimes boys will drop the S in English, not always, but sometimes. Anyway, so Manoli Priniotakis. It is
And
a
is
very
that like
Greek
a
name.
Greek version of Manuel
It is.
in the
It's the
Latin?
same origin. It's Emmanuel. So,
Emmanuel, of
and my
course.
father, it's again a little complicated. Generally speaking, boys are not named after their father. I was named after my father, which my grandmother never forgave my mother for. But the it's what's considered bad luck, and effectively,
Oh, well,
Same in Jewish culture. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
unless there's a deceased, they're
If
deceased.
they're deceased, it's okay, but not if they're living.
Yeah,
this would be a tremendous showdown. Which culture is more superstitious? Round one, Jewish versus Greek. You
well,
know, other
my
good
They both
competitors,
win.
Chinese versus Indian, you know.
And so, yeah, my father actually goes by Emmanuel, both Manoli and Emmanuel. But that's the translation, Manuel, Manolo, so forth.
And in some countries, you can tell where someone is from roughly based on their last name.
Yeah,
Like in Spain, for example, Basque names are identifiable. Names that had Moorish origins or Jewish origins are identifiable. Is that the case in Greece?
absolutely. Absolutely. The different regions, different islands. And in my case, Priniotakis is very, and it's actually including Manolis Priniotakis, very distinctly from Crete. My family,
Mm.
both sides of my family, the heritage is from Crete. Just a quick aside, an interesting point
We
that
love asides.
It's
um,
all asides.
It's
my
all asides.
my paternal grandmother's name was Eftihia Anastastakis, and she was from a
Mm.
small town in Crete called Episkopi. Anastastakis, if that at all sounds, every Greek claims this, every Greek
Anastasia?
American claims it.
Anastasia?
No,
No.
Anastastakis, there was a actor named Yanis Anastastakis
Oh.
who anglicized his name to John Aniston, who's
Oh,
Oh.
yes.
Jennifer Aniston's
Right.
father.
Father. Wow.
So, who is also from Crete. So I mean, nobody's actually verified this, but there's a lot of discussion this in my family. Some of my cousins are like, oh yeah, of course, absolutely, it's true. But I've never actually seen anything fully that
Yeah,
verifies
in
it.
my
But
grandmother's generation, so if she were alive, she'd be 120 this year. Uh, she had a whole bunch of cousins and aunts who all had these classical first names. And there was a period of time, I'm Puerto Rican, yay for the halftime show. Uh, and but I've discussed this with Cubans who say it's the same. Whatever that was, 100 years, 120 years ago, at the turn of the century, the previous century, it was in fashion to give your children classical names. So she had a cousin or an aunt named Agrippina, which is like, where the heck does that come? I
Mhm.
mean, I know, I think it was Nero who has an Agrippina as a wife or as a mother. I don't know, whichever one it was, he probably killed her. And that's what Nero did.
Mhm.
But my grandmother's name was Obdulia,
Uh,
which still exists. And I don't know if it's some version of Ophelia or some feminization of Abdul. And then she had another aunt named Gumel Sinda,
Ooh.
which she was known as Aunt Gume. Uh,
Hmm.
but it was just a very funny little period.
Yeah, well, and Greek names are very regimented. As I was saying before, was the my name is I shouldn't have my name. My name should be Dimitri, because that was my grandfather's name. And so first boy, paternal grandfather. I think this is the way it works now. First boy, paternal grandfather. First girl, paternal grandmother. So you can have multiple, and then second boy, maternal grandfather. Second girl, so you need to have a lot of children before you start to have any choices. Although I think a lot of that's broken down now. But you end up having cousins all with the same name of the same generation. Like my sister, there's a whole generation of Eftihias because that was my
Mhm.
paternal grandmother's name. And then there were fewer boys, but there were Dimitris, and so it was just it's all very, very regimented. However, my grandparents were both one of, I think, more than 10 kids on both sides. And so then you get to the bottom that you start getting these more unusual names. And I actually have I think it was one of my father's first cousins who was Socrates Priniotakis. There was
Oh,
a
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Socrates
yeah.
And you've seen that more and more where people are giving their children names from antiquity and from other places,
Yeah.
like the early Greek monarchs from the 19th century,
Just to finish our the naming segment of our show, of our conversation,
Not
my
quite done
cousin.
yet. I have another question
Oh,
for
you want
you.
to?
I
Oh,
have
my
another point on
cousin.
my mother's side, the Norwegian side.
Oh, so my cousin is the third, Ignacio Lopez the third, and he had a son, Ignacio Lopez the fourth. But he was just, I guess, obsessed with continuing this idea of the third, the fourth, the fifth. And so, to make sure that it stuck with him, his son's name is Ignacio, first name Ignacio, middle name Cuatro, four,
Hmm.
Lopez. So that's what he insisted on. And that was, I forget the other. So your turn, Julia.
Oh, so Dimitri, so it just, I mean, this is just ignorance, but did the Cretans, do you avoid the term Cretan so it doesn't sound like Cretan?
I guess I think I said Demetrius. I meant Vasily. I can't believe I said that. My name should be Vasily. My grandfather's name
Oh,
was Vasily,
Vasily.
not Demetrius.
Okay,
That was
Demetrius,
that
but
was the mistake.
did the Greeks settle in Russia, or is it just a coincidence that Dimitri is such a common name in Russia?
I'm not sure about the so Demetrius is James, is the equivalent of James. And so, I'm imagining there's biblical connectivity because, Cyril, and again, I want to be careful I don't get way out of my lane on history. But if you go to Macedonia, or the Republic of North Macedonia, it's for my Greek family to make sure I get that right. Um, there's the University of Saint Cyril and Methodius. So, right, Cyril and Methodius took Orthodoxy to Russia and took the Cyrillic alphabet, right? The
Oh,
Cyrillic alphabet
So the
grows
story I
out of
know
the Greek
is that
alphabet.
right. Good, thank you.
one of the early Rus, because that area up there was known as Rus, and
Yeah.
then there were a bunch of people that would, on horseback
Hmm.
visit and associate themselves. They were not Christian yet. I don't know, 600, 400, 700, sometime there after, I think after Western Rome ends. And so the Rus ruler, not yet a czar, said, "Oh, I think we should become Christian, but what kind of Christian should we be?" Or he may even have considered Jews as well. We need to be monotheistic. So he had them all come and talk to him. This is the story.
To
Hmm.
like sell
One,
him on the different
And
yes,
traditions.
this
and the
is
one
flooding
he
I
with
like
liked,
grace.
pitching.
yeah, and the one he liked best that made most sense were the Greek Orthodox or the
Uh,
they weren't, I don't think, even known as Orthodox yet, but the Greek explanation
Mhm.
of religion was the
who
one
were
that
close
he,
to the Gnostics, right? I mean, that was a pretty mystical, ritual-based tradition.
yeah,
That's Vladimir the Great, if I'm not mistaken,
yeah.
who makes that the decision. Yeah, from Kiev
So
originally.
Manoli, did you uh, work did your uh, career begin at the Department of Energy, or did you do something else? And
Oh,
what would you claim to be an expert on?
Yeah, and how would you introduce
And
yourself?
and the correct answer could be nothing,
yeah.
but
So I've had an interesting professional life. When I graduated from college, I a very quick story. I decided to do some backpacking. I ended up backpacking from in Eastern Europe. I spent about 6 months in Eastern Europe. Spent some time in Russia. Went to actually, this is one of my. I have it around here someplace. I went to actually I have it right here. Hold on, just 1 second. Went to Michael Jackson concert in Moscow
oh, nice.
in 1996. Had a great time. Um, and came back to Washington State where I grew up and was looking for what to do. Ended up in Seattle through various decision-making processes rather than moving into Portland, and bumped into somebody who I had gone to high school with, and she was working for a temp agency and said, "Why don't you come to if you're looking for a job? The company I'm working for is recruiting for this uh, company that's going to sell books on the internet. Do you know anything about books?" I was like, "Well, I was an English major." She's like, "What about the internet?" I was like, "Well, this was 1996." I was, "Well, I had an email account for the last few months of my time in college." And it turned out it was Amazon.
Yeah.
So I spent the first few years of my working life at Amazon.com, which, um, I oftentimes tell people not to use my decision to leave as a, a test of my decision-making processes. But I did leave in 1998. The joke I sometimes tell is that, it was the heady days of 1998. People were lining up to throw money at bad ideas, and I had no shortage of bad ideas. But what actually happened is I'll spare you the long story. I ended up working for a company in Prague. I moved to go work for an internet company in Prague. And it didn't look like it was going anywhere. It was a long story. It was a little bit of a strange time, but I had a blast. So living in Prague, and somebody I'd known at Amazon's father was opening a company in the UK. So I ended up moving to London, and I ended up staying in London for about 5 years.
Nice.
And at one point, the first place I worked for didn't really pan out great. The second place I worked for was a company called eToys,
Hmm.
which actually was quite successful in the
I
United
sort
States for
of
a couple of
remember
years.
e-toys.
I
There's a
kind of
lot,
do too. It was
th-
like Amazon except toys.
yeah, and it's complicated as to why it failed. I mean, it went belly up in the bust and when the internet bubble burst. And it was interesting an idea. I learned a tremendous amount. I had no idea what I was doing. I was like 23 or 24 years old. I was having a great time, and we were, I think, doing well. There's a lot of reasons why it ended up failing. I never really saw them because I was in Europe, but when I mentioned eToys to people in the United States, sometimes they remember the like apparently really emotional, really tearjerker commercials they ran. I'm sure they're on
Hmm.
YouTube. I've never actually. I'd have to go and look at them, but that's one of the memories that people have of eToys. Company went out of business. I ended up with a big chunk of money because I was a local hire, so I got a big severance package. And what I ended up doing was traveling from Cairo to Istanbul over land and then from Istanbul to Beijing. And that kind of got me back into this international relations mindset. This was in 2001, mind you. So I flew out of Beijing in actually out of Hong Kong in like in August of 2001, went to Washington State. My sister was getting married, ended up back in London in September of 2001. So I think another few months, none of what I did backpacking through Central Asia would have been possible. I'm sure
Right.
it wouldn't be
Yeah.
possible, at least not very easily. I'm sure that it's possible. It was also a really formative time. I'm a big proponent of that, of sort of backpacking as a way of, self-actualization and exploration. But it was different then. And I don't know if either of you've done that sort of travel, but when I was, especially like in '96, when I was in Russia and even in Poland, like you're out of touch, you were out of touch. Like it was in Russia, you still had to go and find some place where you can make a long distance phone call. It was not so easy. And in 2001 in like rural Uzbekistan, it was kind of the same deal. Now, I think you can effectively live stream the whole thing. You can communicate with people anywhere. It was in
Can live
2001 we were
stream
starting
from
to
the
fly.
top of Mount Everest.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's part of the point now.
Yeah. And it was,
Yeah.
for me, the point was sort of getting away from things. And, I spent time in Xinjiang and learned about the Uyghurs. And anyways, it was an interesting period. So I ended up going back to grad school, and I went from grad school into the Department of Energy, into the policy office.
And what
So I
were you
was
studying
interested.
in grad school?
So I went to Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I studied strategic studies and conflict management. It was
So you didn't do a scientific thing.
no, no, and I've always come at it from more of a policy and economics perspective than a technical perspective. One of the things I've always taken some pride in is being able to work with the technical experts to translate their work for policymaker consumption. And that's a big deal at
That's
DOE
huge. Huge, huge,
because you have
huge.
people who have deep technical expertise, and then you have people who don't. And as political appointees, Schedule C, that's their prerogative to not have deep technical expertise, but they're in the position for whatever reason the leadership of the administration chose. So they need to understand enough. So, being able to do that translation is something that I've always taken pride in. And it's really about how to communicate excellent, in particular at DOE, we used to say experimentally validated analysis, just really, really good technical work by people at the national laboratories or people at headquarters. But sometimes there needed to be a bit of a bridge so that lay policymakers could understand it. And you'd even have differences in the same room where you'd have like a secretary with a more general background and a deputy or an undersecretary with deep technical. So it's always finding that balance, and sometimes that was flipped. But
Do
no,
you feel like that was like that kind of liaison sort of cognitive work that you excel at is part of why I mean the way I know you is as lead at NIU. I think you were president at NIU.
it was vice
Vice
president of
president.
research
Yeah.
at NIU.
Yeah, of research.
And
Yeah.
we say what NIU is.
National
So
Intelligence University. Yeah.
yes, the ODNI's degree granting university, although ODNI the last time I checked, but maybe not much longer.
It's
Not much
transitioning.
longer, right? They're
I mean,
in
it's public,
transition.
right? They're
Huh?
transitioning. Isn't it public that they're transitioning?
Yeah, well, I think yes, it is public that they're transitioning. Yes.
Yeah, to National Defense
Right.
University, right? Not renaming, but they're going to be under the
Yeah,
auspices
but I don't
of.
think the details have been finalized yet. But
Yeah, I don't
yeah.
know. But in any case, I feel like you used that capacity, that sort of bridging capacity from the technical or scientific to the policy, to the policymaker capacity throughout your career. It sounds like it. Am I assessing that correctly?
Yeah, I think I've been quite lucky. I would hope that that's true. I've been quite lucky so I'm now retired as a federal employee. I retired last year out of ODNI. But if you track my time in government, so I had a successive positions. I was an analyst. I was a sort of manager-ish of analysts early on in my intelligence career. I then moved to the President's Daily Brief staff and was chief of staff of the President's Daily Brief staff, and then went back to
In the
DOE
ODNI.
in ODNI.
And
In ODNI.
whom did you work with, provided you can say their names? Or even the first name is okay.
Matt.
Oh yeah, I know Matt very
Good old
well.
Well,
Matt.
Yeah.
okay.
Good old
Matt,
Matt. I know
Matt,
Matt.
and then
Yes.
Jack. Matt, and then
Yes.
Jack.
Yeah. Oh, Jack too.
Yep. And what's interesting is they followed each other in a number of jobs. So a lot of people
Yeah,
have
that's
had
true.
that.
Yeah.
Does CIA have their own PDB? I mean, no.
No.
So ODNI does
so
the
what
PDB.
happened when the Director of National Intelligence was formed in 2004, I think
Yeah, 2004, the
was,
law is passed. 2005 is really when they
stood
start
up.
getting
Okay.
things organized.
And so one of the things was that the DNI would be responsible for the president's daily brief. But it took many, many years for the DNI to develop. So for a very long time, that task was sort of delegated to the CIA. And then very slowly, it began to acquire more of a community feel. I don't know where things stand now. I don't know, even though
You know,
I don't
I
know even that it's important, but for about 10 years, the CIA routinely contributed more than 50% of what appeared in the PDB, but I don't know where it stands now. And I
I
don't even know, if you ask me, that the concept of a PDB even makes sense anymore. But since the intelligence community is so hidebound and traditional in its approach to everything, who knows if they even have that view.
yeah, I mean it's I don't want to say I have complicated views about the PDB. I was in and around
Let's
the
just say that's
PDB
the
for
president's daily brief for
yes,
people who
President Taylor
might
Breeze.
not.
I was in and around it for really from 2008 until 18. So for about a decade, I think I
Yeah.
was in and around it quite extensively because after I went back to DOE, I ran the daily briefings for a succession of secretaries of energy. And although I guess I can't say that he was technically a recipient, I don't. Anyway, that's where it gets a little bit fuzzy on. But the PDB is an interesting beast, as you said. The case for the PDB is is there enough strategic level information every day for the president that's worthy of the president's time?
That's
But I think
always my question.
in both directions, it's this is the intelligence community's opportunity to speak directly to the president and to the cabinet, at least the national security cabinet members. And it's nowhere, it's almost, especially with Presidential Records Act issues, it's like it doesn't really happen with the president otherwise, where there's an unfiltered line into the
Hmm.
president. And then also, woe be the president who doesn't take it. The schedule is published, and then there's a record,
Yes.
people count it. I don't think that this administration that's necessarily as much of an issue as it's been in the past, but I do know of at least one president who's been counseled by somebody quite senior not to take the PDB, that there was not enough strategic information to be worthy
Oh,
of
I
that.
mean,
But he did anyways. He
yeah,
did, I think partly because of the potential opprobrium of not taking it.
exactly. And there was this, just to do a couple of more minutes on this. So, the question of how you acquire the information and knowledge you need to make decisions is a complicated one. I was taking a little survey test related on some personality tests, and there was a question on it that actually said, when you make decisions, do you let your emotions interfere with your decision making? And I like put out the red card on that. What do you mean? Emotions are part of decision making, and there's a lot of stuff that tells you that. Well, anyway,
They're just asking you the question, are you aware that you do or not? That's
yes.
really the
Well,
question.
who knows? Anyway, so during 9/11, after 9/11, the PDB was probably in its glory days, because we were, the president was personally involved and the cabinet to prevent a terrorist attack, to chase down Osama bin Laden, and so forth and so on. So, and they did not want to be blindsided on this issue. Uh, So that was an extraordinary period. But decisions are not made top down. They shouldn't be made top down, and they generally aren't made top down. So we would often give the president and the cabinet information that was so secret squirrel that the people who worked for him or her didn't have it, which led to very complicated and messy and bad, potentially, decision making. And this presumption, and then the other thing I would add is that the CIA and DNI in particular, I think, and to some extent the FBI, used it as a way of enhancing its bureaucratic position in the government. So, oh, we get 15 minutes with the president every day. You don't, kind of thing. And I found that to be distasteful.
Well, as an institution, it does have a, particular role. I know other agencies didn't love that ability. And, you get the leadership, just even some of the steps that they did at the NSC to prepare the National Security Advisor, some extraordinary stuff that was done over time. In part because, I think the last thing is if you're a national security advisor and there's something in the PDB and the president turns to the national security advisor and says, so what are we doing about this? The answer you don't want to have to give is, oh, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a lot of like preparation but then at the same time, there's questions about what is disclosed in advance so that you don't end up getting into a political interference or political pressure. This is all the stuff. And this goes back to the very first thing we were talking about. Like the foundation of all the work that's done in the community is in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And it is that tension within our system of government, any democracy, of secrecy and accountability.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to have secrets and secret agencies in a democracy, especially one that then has it's a representative democracy where the Congress is the proxy for the American people. And, a good relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch on intelligence is vitally important for the health of our democracy.
Exactly.
The challenge, of course, sometimes is the only thing, with the only thing lower held in less regard with the public than the intelligence community is oftentimes Congress. So it doesn't always help that relationship make that relationship work, but it's extremely important. I took that part of my job really seriously. I thought it was really valuable to understand what the Congress needed and not to take an adversarial tone. We're also very small, so I was able to do that. But just get back, well, Julie, you were asking about this sort of.
So I think Julia is either asleep or frozen.
So can you hear me right now?
Yeah, we can hear you. So that's good.
I look asleep and you all are frozen on my screen. Are you two
Ah.
frozen?
No, we are
Okay.
fine with each other.
Well, so I'm going to say this from my sleep state that appears on your screen.
But you look very calm.
Yeah, I'm sleeping, I guess. I don't know. I see that too. What I want to ask you both is, which I just formulated that this is the key question that I have really for both of you, but largely for Manolis. Manoli, sorry. What would you change? What do you think is the highest priority thing to change about the way the intelligence community operates in order for it to become more functional and useful?
Well, first of all, I would, I don't mean to be picky, but I would say it is useful and functional. I think the biggest challenge that we have right now, and maybe this won't be a particular novel idea, but I think it's extraordinarily important is how you manage the adoption of new technology in a way that improves the way people think and the way that the community supports decisions in a supplementing way, in some cases, an offsetting way. I think that's something that people don't necessarily like to think about too much, but I think there is a level of work that can be offset.
What do you mean
Um,
by offset? I'm
I
not
think
clear.
there's some
Yeah, I
basic
don't totally get that either.
I think
But
there's some stuff that the technology can do that people have been doing, and there's some element of that already. And this sort of Turing machine on the edge. I think um, there's a role for technology to offset some of this
It
sort
looks
of
like we
grunt
lost
work. I mean, that's the
Julia.
whole point, right? Like about hopefully she'll
She'll
come back.
come back.
Is a whole the point of using technology to improve efficiency. I just so much of the discussions I've heard with about analysis and to some extent with collections is about don't worry, we still need you, you're not going to lose your job. But there is work that should be offset and replaced
Exactly.
by the
Yeah,
technology.
I
It's just
agree. I
finding
mean,
what those are.
yeah, play around with Chat GPT, frequently, try to explore what it can do. Clearly, constantly improving, way better now. And I see a future where uh, every significant decision maker will have their own AI engine that real human beings, real human brains should help curate, but that nevertheless will be kind of the primary response point
Mhm.
for information issues.
Yeah, and I know you were an early adopter or early user. I remember hearing those conversations when, with or having those conversations with you when it first came out. I mean, I think even in the past week with the Codex and whatever Anthropic's coding tools, they've really gotten good. I played around with Codex, while I was doing something else. I was playing around with Codex last week and developed a prototype of a functional app in about 3 hours.
Yeah,
And it actually does what I need it to do right now. It's not like it's going to go out on the app store anytime soon and make me any money, but it does what I needed it to. And
right,
I
right.
and I built it just playing around while I was working on something else. So, we keep like hitting these inflection points, and how that is adopted into the community is going to continuously be a question. I think you look at how the Chinese are adopting, even if it's not with the strength and power of the compute and models that are the U.S. Is able to provide. It's still like the integration
Hmm.
it is just remarkable, and I think that's also where
We're
uh,
talking AI now.
yeah,
I know you.
the integration and adoption is really where things are at a different pace. And the civil military fusion in China just allows for that. I heard an interesting discussion a few weeks ago, actually involving, well, it was public. So Dennis Wilder, who I know, Carmen, you know
Yes.
well from CIA, and a couple other people talking about sort of Chinese concepts of AI and the sort of going back into sort of Chinese concepts of cybernetics and Soviet concepts of cybernetics
What
and
does that mean
well,
exactly?
so in this
Cybernetics.
context, it's about the role of technology in influencing society, and
Mhm.
I think is maybe a way to put it, and how we talk very much about the Chinese about artificial intelligence supplementing human endeavor, and whereas the interpretation of the Chinese look at it as a mechanism for control. And this gets into sort of historic Chinese Soviet concepts of controlling
question
society
about that.
and technology.
Sorry, this is a burning question. And since I was asleep, I thought of it apparently when I was out. But I hear a lot about um, the race with China on AI and how there's sort of we sort of lust after their level of control in a certain sense. It feels like, but why can't we? I don't know, maybe we already are, but it seems to me we're not racing towards the same finish line. So it feels like their finish line is using AI to control, just like you said, and our finish line is using AI to enhance human endeavor, just like you spoke. And how about we acknowledge that that's a different finish line, and therefore we're not in the same race.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And a lot of people have criticized the concept of, or the metaphor of the race. There's the old saying, if you don't know where you're going, like any map will do. And so, like, what is the end point? You know, I again, this is I'm borrowed from this discussion that I heard at Georgetown a few weeks ago, or a couple months ago now. That sort of the idea that um, uh, the idea that um, our historic perspectives, like our portrayals in popular culture of a fully automated future or the artificial intelligence focused, tend to be dystopic, right?
Yes,
Like
they
the
are.
the Terminator and so forth.
Except for the Jetsons.
When the Jetsons are a little company, I saw
But
some post
that's
the
more
other
like
day that
human endeavor, so like they're like cars.
yeah, and the Jetsons is a little bit, but the Jetsons were dealing with some stuff too. I saw something the other day that was startling that it was, I guess, in one of the episodes of George Jetson's ID is displayed. And I discovered I'm older than George Jetson was when in the show.
Oh,
But our portrayals tend to be dystopic, and their perspective is not that. This sort of mechanism of control is a desirable outcome. And but maybe some of that is changing. Again, this was this discussion at Georgetown that I'm borrowing from, but the idea that even just how military officers operate in the United States versus in China, that there's so much top-down direction that there isn't the concept of commander's intent. Whereas, there's a lot of overbuilding on the comm system in the Chinese military because they're afraid of losing touch with higher headquarters. Whereas a U.S. military officer, the moment they lose touch with higher headquarters is like, all right, now I can go
hooray.
and get some
Yes,
stuff
now
done.
we can.
Because that's where the training, the commander's intent, and the preparation all comes into play. And she has actually lamented that in China as the military officers. I think it's the five, uh, not intolerable. So there's a phrase that
I'm
they
sorry, be
they call
clear on that.
she. So
What does Chi
Xi Jinping,
lament?
that there's the Chinese military officers are lacking in some of those
Oh,
skills,
so Chi
flexibility, agility.
recognizes that this
Yeah,
is not
these
a good model.
yeah, that there's some lacking there that the U.S. Military uh, just has innately because of the way we do our training,
Although he might be
which
somewhat wrong given the recent news about the generals who have been thinking out on him.
yeah, maybe so.
I mean,
But that also again comes down to our sort of faith in like the individual and faith in humanity and our system that I
but
feel like I'm getting a little bit of, outside of my
no,
typical
this is what
No,
all we
no,
do
we
is
love
talk
it.
about
We
stuff that
love
we
it.
don't understand. Well, so, but the faith in the individual and faith in the system feels to me like at the very beginning of our conversation, you were talking about your path and, we were talking about how an analyst is considered a generalist, et cetera, but people are expected to come in and do the thing that they were trained to do. So there's sort of this like there's a prioritization of generalists while at the same time de facto bureaucratic push towards specialists. And it feels to me that what's missing, I'm going to answer the question from the outside about how to make the intelligence community more functional. I'm not saying it's not functional, but more functional and more useful, because it's certainly useful, is faith in the individual. Like there seems to be a lack of trust uh, that is endemic in the intelligence community. And what would it be like if there was more trust and faith in the people that were hired? Because the hiring process is arduous and thorough. And so either you trust the process or you don't. If you don't trust the process, then make it better. If you do trust the process, then trust the people you've hired. So anyway, I'm just sort of curious.
Yeah, well, I know both of you have done a lot of thinking about things like intuition, and this is where, the faith in the individual versus faith in process, I think there's a tension in the community, especially on analytic functions. There's the book that Bruce Peace wrote about
Yes,
managing
on
intelligence
managing, yeah,
analytic organizations.
yeah,
And there's a line in there, I think he does a really nice job discussing tradecraft, analytic tradecraft. And he quotes the idea that I guess it's in the Navy, that the Navy has a saying that's something along the lines of our procedures are written in blood. And it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? So like, well, we have that procedure because like you have to wear those goggles when you're fiddling with the engine because some poor sailor lost an eye doing it in the past, right? Something bad happened. So now we've got procedures. So in a sense, analytic tradecraft, it grows out of operational tradecraft, and operational tradecraft developed because things weren't working, right? So they developed ways to do stuff to evade surveillance, what have you, so that they could actually accomplish their mission. Analytical tradecraft, to some extent, there's the 70s is an interesting period with Colby and Sam Wilson, if you're familiar with some of that history, that they kind of realized that we need to professionalize this part of the community. But really, the things that we think about most on tradecraft these days are the post 9/11 changes. There's been a developments over time, but those again were, not dissimilar to the idea of these procedures are written in blood, right? Things didn't go well, and we had these outcomes. We've had these intelligence failures, and after each set of failures, there's sort of new procedures. The trouble is when, the procedures become ritualistic and displace rigor. So this is like the real tension between sort of the hard work of doing the cognition and understanding, and the sort of procedural
Well,
part
that's
of
one
supporting
problem.
critical thinking.
That's one problem is when they become rigid and then you dismiss other ways of getting information or other methodologies. But in fact, sort of implicitly they're implied when something's a success that was different than the analytic tradecraft methodologies. It's sort of like backwards causation. You say that that was a good idea. But the other problem seems to me that so my understanding from what you're saying is that analytic tradecraft was changed after 9/11. What is the tool used to assess whether those changes were a good idea or very helpful or made a difference? Or, I mean, I don't, what's the assessment tool?
Well, so I think what they didn't necessarily change, they just became more explicit. I don't know if Carmen, you'd agree that in post 9/11 it was because the big innovation would be Intelligence Community Directive 203. And again, it's very bureaucratic, but it's these sort of 9 steps that you have to go through to understand or to be producing, good analysis
I've
under the
seen it. It reads
definitions of
very much
203.
like an AP history rubric for an
Yeah,
essay.
yeah, and so then there's tradecraft analysis that's done by an office at ODNI, and they created the position of ombuds, analytic ombuds, to sort of try to stamp out some of the political interference, and with varying levels of success over time. But the question is whether or not this has been effective. I mean,
And
that this
how
is
would you assess that?
this is
So
the
there
sort of
was, if I can jump in, there was an effort, and really the changes to analysis after 9/11 is probably at the heart of my career at the agency. Um, so there was an attempt to try to figure out if we were correct. So there was a team who came up with a rubric that identified an analytic prediction, or often we use the word a call, as that was an easy call, that was a medium call, or that was a really hard one. And then they would, uh, and this is very hard to do because the time frame is really elastic. really elastic. And then did we get it right? And then they had to sort of figure out what's the right time frame in which to assess did we get it right.
That's a big issue. Yeah.
That's a huge, huge issue.
Right.
And
Eventually
so,
Cuba will fall.
yeah, yes, exactly. So they found, not surprisingly, that we were very good on the easy ones and very not good on the hard ones. And the point I made is the only reason why you have a multi-billion-dollar intelligence community is to be good on the hard ones, because the easy ones, you don't need a multi-billion-dollar intelligence community. It was like basically conventional wisdom that X or Y was going to happen. So, this question of what's the right way to get better at the really hard questions, that is, I don't think that has ever been, to my knowledge, Manoli, appropriately tackled by the intelligence community. I don't know that it's been appropriately tackled by anybody.
Well,
Manoli.
yeah, and this is one of the complications or the difficulties. I just saw it at NIU of doing empirical research on the intelligence community. You think it's difficult on the analytics side. Like
Oh
try
my God.
tackling counterintelligence,
Oh my God.
um, or other aspects. There are actually some pockets of the community actually I think would do a really quite good job of assessing their performance and analyzing the way they operate. But I think it's frankly more on the collection side, and sort of a broader operational side. But it's a hard thing to do. It's just the same as like writing performance evaluation objectives for analysts. A lot of places, I think there's been this goal of trying to move away from quantitative measures, because quantitative measures, don't tell you very much on analyst, the quality of an analyst. Well, they don't tell you at all anything about the quality of an analyst's output. It's a hard thing to do. Everybody talks about like smart performance objectives. It's not easy to do them for analysts, and that's true at the organizational level, and that's true even going further up to at the community level. No, I don't think that there's been so it's even like, the structured analytic techniques, right?
Yes.
What the empirical evidence on the utility. I think there is utility in organizing your thought, but whether or not they lead to better analysis is there was a Rand study, there was the Rob Johnston's but it's still,
Yeah.
there's not a lot that's been done, but it's one of the challenges. And I don't say that to disregard the training that some of the organizations that focus on structured analytic techniques provide. I think it's valuable training and it's good for analysts to understand these concepts. Where I think there is promise is the potential for technology to
Yes.
make
Yes.
use of some of the
Yes.
concepts.
Yes. I
Uh,
agree.
but that's not going to necessarily help an analyst think better. So you have to marry both. You have to have the analyst doing the work of understanding how their cognitive processes, but then you can also use the technology to operationalize some of the
Yeah.
models.
Well,
So
and you
this is
can ask the technology to help the analyst understand their cognitive. I mean, if we do it right, the technology can actually prompt some queries.
Yeah, and this is where I used to joke that, I'm not sure I believe this so much anymore, but I used to joke that the analyst of the future is going to be somewhere between a bookie and an actuary. Uh, that effectively setting, what's the difference between an actuary and a bookie? Like a bookie gives themselves an extra 7%.
Yeah.
There's the VIG. The odds add up to 107, not to 100. And how do you develop a probabilistic understanding of the future? That's where, I've seen some studies at agency levels of trying to do what you were talking about, Carmen, of looking at past performance. And this is where it gets hard. Agencies, we're not in the prediction business, so we're not setting up a horse race. You're not
Oh, we
predicting a
say we're not
specific
in the
outcome.
prediction business,
But
Well,
that's
but
how
but
you're judging these
but
things.
but
That
we
then but
are in
then
the
that's how
prediction
you
business.
okay,
that's right.
then set odds. Let's set odds. And you get that even in I guess in the ICD 203, but in, other documents, it'll, what is likely to, and,
All the prediction markets and
the
And
probabilistic
almost all of
language.
that, by the way, and we're beyond our hours, so I want to
Okay.
respect time. No, but a lot of that I've learned after after my government service, I've learned a lot about sort of the psychology of communications, that, the person receiving that product isn't really attuned to the differences between likely and probably and may and whatever, and all of this hand wringing that we're doing on explaining those terms is basically meaningless to many customers. So it's kind of pointless.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had some, I have to say there's a couple conversations I had with policymakers over time, specifically on those issues, which are some of the more painful experiences of my time in government. Um,
Well, my
this,
favorite to talk about is worst case scenario. And this is worth talking about, I think, where um, often we will say X is a worst case scenario. And in this particular story I'm telling, X happened. And the policymaker was livid because he felt he had not been warned that X was going to happen. And we said, "Oh no, we told you." It wasn't me, but it was the team that was engaged with the customer. Said, "Oh no, we told you that X could happen." And the customer goes, "You said that was a worst case scenario." Angry.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
went, ding, light bulb. When I say worst case scenario, the customer, that one, and I'm sure many others here, unlikely.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, immediately that must be divorced from our analytic vocabulary, I
Yeah,
think.
and there's the probably apocryphal, but the attributed to Henry Kissinger, the analyst who briefed him on something, and then he did something else anyways. The analyst went back. It's like, what? It's like, well, you told me, you just didn't convince me, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of these stories. Um, this is a fundamental tension that we struggle with,
But
and
this metaphor of who the analyst is, you said between a bookie and an actuary, I think is really important. Like if we could understand what the metaphor, like I think the actual metaphor from the outside, it looks to me like who an analyst is a cross between a psychic and a doctor. In that there's this complex system, we don't understand it. This is the feeling I have. I'm going to report some data that support the feeling. And in my professional estimation, this is likely to happen. And like that's what you get. I I feel the concern of the actuary and the bookie, those are all based on numbers that we don't have in the circumstance of any kind of intelligence analyst.
well, yeah, but okay, but what are the various outcomes? What that you are assessing odds against? What are the outcomes? What are the
Whatever
scenarios?
they are.
And this is where, the question, and again, I said I don't know if I'm convinced by it, but the sort of bookie and actuary formulation, but it's setting up the race and then using the technology to establish the odds based on the data. The question, I had a conversation with somebody, this is years ago, about actuaries that, for centuries, actuaries were, it was almost like, magic, right? That they went
Right.
away. And then when the electronic spreadsheet came about, people were like, oh, wait, this is all you're doing? Is like, oh, I can do this. It sort of demystified insurance. And I'm actually really interested in sort of the insure tech industry, like the developments of the use of technology for insurance purposes. Because like if you go onto a website that offers auto insurance, right? It's not like some mini actuary in the back. You fill out a form online. The data is enough to give, an outcome of what the likelihood of you getting into a wreck is, which then, gives them the guidance to give you a price. It's not some actuary in back, like very magically, very quickly doing a calculation. It's not, it's automated now, and they're moving into other areas to be able to do that as well. So that is, I think, the fundamental question was when you came back from your quick departure,
Nap.
what is the role of artificial intelligence? What is the role of technology and analytic functions? And what is the analyst role in that? The phrase that everybody likes to use is team, uh, human machine teaming. Like, what is the appropriate balance there? Because you know you can you can assign different parts of the responsibility to both. What I think is going to happen over the next 10 years, um, I think one of the things that's going to drive change in the intelligence community on how information is conveyed to policymakers is actually going to come from the policymakers. And as Carmen, you were saying, people are like, I don't understand the difference between doing highly likely and maybe, whatever, the different probable, I guess we don't say maybe, but different probabilistic language. But there's going to be, people who are less patient with long form narrative. I mean, I think the long form, 10 to 20 page papers, I don't know if anybody reads those anymore anyways, but even the single page narratives as opposed to more interactive. I was involved more interactive analytic work. I think you're going to see that, especially as the generational change and comfort with technology. It's already happening, but it's become even more so. And the community is going to struggle to make those
Absolutely.
adjustments. I
It,
mean,
it is going
it's
to
struggled
struggle.
anyways. Yeah.
So listen, I know we're like 10 minutes, almost 15 minutes over our hour, but and I had a bunch of questions I wanted to ask you. Like, I don't know if we can do a lightning round.
Sure.
I wanted to
Let's do
ask you,
lightning round.
I wanted to ask you about cold fusion, forever coming and never arriving.
I don't know if I have anything intelligent. The thing about fusion that's interesting is I'm very interested in understanding. Okay, so there's fusion, there's small modular reactors, there's advanced reactor designs. Yes, the joke about fusion is that it's 20 years away and always will be.
Yeah.
Um, it's they did have the success, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but they did have the success at the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore, where they got more power out than they put into it. Um, but the thing that I'm in some ways more interested in is the real challenges we're having, not just as a country, but as a society, on dealing with the anticipated power demand for artificial intelligence, but looking at it as a system, the whole value chain, the chips, the power plants, the algorithms, the data, but also like the nuclear implications, the low enriched, high assay, low enriched uranium that's going to be necessary. Like, where is all of the supply going to come from? We have this U.S. company Centrus that is now delivering HALEU, but it's going to, the demands are going to increase, we think, over time. How do you think about this all as a system? I think the one
Mhm.
thing that this administration has done that's quite interesting is put out the RFPs to build power plants and data centers on Department of Energy facilities to be able to bring some of that, inside the wire. But it brings in a whole host of other supply chain complications like water and how does this
Welders.
fit? No, literally
Well,
welders. I
Yeah.
was just going to say welders and electric. This is where the debate over welders and electricians part of it comes in. But even more so, how does, how to put it on federal property maybe alleviate some of this, but how do you, how do you deal with putting these facilities putting these facilities in communities that won't benefit from them?
you know
Um, I know in the data center, that's a big issue. That's especially in Northern Virginia. That's been a
what's
big.
really interesting about Texas is that of the Western states, I think I'm right, and I'll look it up, but uh, the percentage of land in Texas that is owned by the federal government is single digits. Unlike other Western states like Montana or Washington
Nevada.
State or whatever, Nevada, where I don't know, maybe it's 50%, it's a big number or more. And of course, it has to do with Texas's peculiar history, where it was an independent nation for 9 years before it joined the United States. And so It was never a territory. It was a territory of Mexico, I guess, but never of the US. So, do you have a lightning round question, Julia?
Well, I don't know if it's possible but yes, of course I do.
Yeah,
I
because I have one last question I wanted to end on, but
I recently became aware in my history of this weird gifted program um, that I was in, and I think it might be related to Department of Energy, but I'm not sure. And I don't know if you know anything about like Department of Energy selecting and tracking students through the course of their lives based on parents who have had radioactive, or maybe
No,
themselves have radiation. No,
no, I
radiation
don't.
exposure.
I
No.
don't. Although, it's interesting. I spent a lot of time at the Nevada nuclear test site, and a lot of time. I've spent some time there. And, what was it, 200 above ground tests and 800 below ground tests. And I think one of the things that's maybe a little striking about it is you can go there. People don't, I think, realize that. Um, and there was a lot of stuff that we did. I don't know about this program that I've not heard about, but there's the complications of sort of dealing with the legacy of testing in the Marshall Islands and different places. Um, I was in Japan late last year, and just having spent a lot of time in and around the nuclear weapons complex, I made the side trip and made a point of going to Hiroshima. And it was actually somewhat, I shouldn't say somewhat. It was an emotional experience, even though I'm not a weapons designer. I've never worked specifically on the weapon systems, but just being in and around DOE, it's part, you don't have to necessarily think too much about the actual implications of their use in the way that you get that very viscerally in at Hiroshima. But no, I mean, there's a whole very interesting issue about tracking more generally and how that relates to the United States' concepts of education and James Conant and the tracking system that was created to effectively find people who could win the Cold War. I'm being a little bit glib, but only slightly. Was a real development in the way higher or secondary schools were operated um, in the mid-century period and has had a lasting impact through to today on how we identify students. And I've seen it firsthand with some of my kids on decisions
Mm.
that are made early on. I was sort of tracked into classes early on that other people may not have been, but and that has an impact. I know our mutual friend Josh Kerbel talks about how K through 12 concepts of analysis have an impact on the way analysis is done in the intelligence community. I
Hmm.
absolutely believe that to be true. So
Yeah,
sorry, I
no
don't know
doubt.
about that specific program.
Right, but conceptually, that's interesting stuff. Thank you.
so my final question, unless, by the way, I leave you space for saying anything you'd like to say. I don't know what you had in mind when we said, "Hey, we'd like to panda you," but as you can tell, we go all over the place. But the question I have, I know you have kids. You've mentioned them a couple of times. How how many? How young is the youngest, or how old is the youngest?
I've got a couple kids, both teenagers, one in college and one in high school.
Boy, girl, boy,
Two
boy, girl,
boys,
girl,
two
two
boys.
boys. So my question is, when they were young and you read to them, what did you like to read to them? What book did you like to read to them? I know that they probably had their preferences, but perhaps regardless of their preference, you had a book that you really liked to read to them.
Um, that's a funny question. And the ones that they loved were the Frog and Toad books. We read so many of
No,
the Frog and Toad books.
no, I've just begun asking this question.
But the other one that I used to enjoy reading, I used to tell them stories. Also, I'd make
Yeah.
up the stories, and they were just like the most nonsensical, incomprehensible stories about. My sister had given us a glass engine that's actually sitting around here someplace, and I made a story about this glass engine that opened a pants factory. So anyways, these stories would kind of go on. Um, and Uh, but the other one that I enjoyed reading, but I just thought was really strange was the Skippy John Jones. Are you
Oh,
familiar
love
with
that
Skippy
one.
John Jones? And it's like a cat that believes it's a Chihuahua.
Yeah.
That
It lives in this delusion its whole life.
yeah, really doesn't. I never quite understood
I
what the
got to look
message
that one
was,
up. Skippy
but
John Jones.
you know, Skippy John Jones was a naughty kitty boy with, two sisters. Anyways, but it was this cat that believed it was a Chihuahua. And anyways, so that's the one that stands out to me that I enjoyed reading. But it was also at the time where you started to get audiobooks, and we'd sometimes play the um,
Oh,
Frog and Toad books on audiobooks as they would be falling asleep. And I remember at one point, like something was wrong, like our internet access went out or it didn't have it, and it started and then it stopped. And then my youngest was like, but he was like, I don't know, 3 or something. And then he just started telling the
doing it.
story. He knew the entire story.
Oh.
And I guess he had heard it enough times that he'd internalized it, that we were kind of struck by the fact that like the story goes out and he's able to just recite the story from memory at that
And
point.
since we spoke so much about names at the beginning, what are your sons' names?
My older son's name is Ari. My younger son's name is Joseph. So,
My
Okay.
son's name is Joseph. Those are two good Jewish names, by the way.
yeah. And well, there's a longer story about where Ari comes from, but yes, Ari and Joseph.
Good
Well, I
names.
know that this has been a particularly meandering panda, I think. And I don't know if there's something that when you thought, oh, I'm going to talk to Carmen and Julia today, I definitely want to bring up X. So I'm going to give you that opportunity.
No, I guess the thing that as I was preparing to think about what we talk about, especially on the role of the embedded agencies,
Uh-huh.
that's one thing that I think is very important, that they exist for a reason. And sometimes you have to look through the history to understand what that reason is. It's not purely just the mission of the organization in which they exist, but the times in which they came about. I think the Department of Energy's intelligence function is a good example of that. It has its roots in the Manhattan Project, but then the transition into sort of grand strategic concepts of deterrence and containment. So not so much on the containment side, but definitely on the deterrent side. And bringing the scientific expertise of the Department of Energy's, what became the Department of Energy's experts against what was really the most pressing issue of the time, which is an existential threat. So understanding where our adversaries or competitors, or even in some cases partners, were on their nuclear weapons programs. And it grows from there to encompass other issues, energy security, critical energy infrastructure protection, all the things that the department does. And people oftentimes forget that or don't realize that when I believe this is true, that the Department of Energy, when it was founded in 1977, was the combination of more independent elements than were combined to create Homeland Security in 2004.
Wow.
So there's these complicated, structures that are still in place. The laboratory, the sort of the, the authority of the lab director in the same way that like Edward Teller had at Livermore in the, going back decades. But you have these mesh of cultures really trying to accomplish some things that are fundamental to our success as a country and our security as a country. I remember I had a boss at DOE Intelligence who used to say, like, look, we're doing nuclear weapons, cyber threats to infrastructure, energy security, and counterintelligence threats to our science and technology research base. That is a fantastic mission set. Like you can't get a more fundamental mission set than that. That the success of the country is underpinned by these concepts. And I agree. I always enjoyed working there. And again, I think you can make the case at each agency that what they're doing is vital to not just the mission of their department, but also the contributions that these really deep subject matter experts bring to the national level as well. It doesn't say that there isn't the same sort of expertise at CIA and DIA, but that closeness to policy, and I don't mean that in a like being overly influenced kind of closeness, but that sort of geographic proximity provides some ability to offer insight that is just, I think, unmatched in other places.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you for chatting with us.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it. It's great to be able to talk to you.